Welcome to Telewizja Republika. European leaders have introduced comprehensive measures aimed at transforming the agricultural sector to achieve ambitious climate goals, considering the sector's significant contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions. That's the official story. But those policies have sparked widespread anger among European farmers, leading to massive protests. The farmers are protesting against the economic burden imposed by the new climate regulations, net zero, green policies, and so on, increased production costs and the competition from cheap foreign imports from countries with less rigorous environmental standards. The protests have gained attention as lawmakers are concerned that so-called far right, the right-wingers, might leverage the farmers' discontent in the run-up to the European Parliament election in June. As a result, some farmers' demands of farmers are being met as lawmakers seek to quell the unrest. Despite these concessions, a segment of the farming community has promised to intensify their efforts against these regulations. It's pretty obvious. People just do not want to lose their money. Those complex changes in balancing climate actions with economic and political realities, what we see is a clash between ideology and reality. On Thursday, farmers from Eastern European and Baltic nations, including Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia and Bulgaria, united in protest against EU policies. Many of the governments in the region have shown support or at least sympathy towards the farmers' cause. At least officially, it means votes. No politician can and want to lose votes. A joint memorandum, as reported by Euroactiv from the agrarian chambers of these nations, voiced opposition to any restrictions on agricultural production sizes. It also advocated for the termination of the duty-free agreement between the EU and Ukraine and demanded a simplification of the regulations under the EU's common agricultural policy. Farmers across various European countries are protesting for a range of reasons specific to their local challenges and the broader EU policies. Here is the set of the reasons for which farmers are protesting in certain states. Here we go. France. They are protesting against EU bureaucracy, high diesel prices and the need for more support to improve incomes. They also are concerned about access to irrigation and they're criticizing animal welfare policies and the use of pesticides. In Poland, main issues are influx of cheap imports from Ukraine and stringent EU regulations. Czech Republic, farmers are frustrated with bureaucracy, cheap imports and the overall EU farm policy. Spain, the protests are against the suffocating bureaucracy. That's the name and that's the reason for which they are protesting, of course, coming from Brussels, that undermines crop profitability and trade deals that facilitate the entry of cheap imports. In Portugal, farmers are voicing their concerns over inadequate state aid, cuts to subsidies and excessive red tape. Romania, the cost of diesel, high insurance rates, EU environmental regulations and cheap imports from Ukraine, those are the primary concerns. We got Belgium. The EU's mandate requiring farmers to leave 4% of land fallow, the impact of cheap imports and subsidies that disproportionately favor larger farms. Those are the key issues. Greece. Farmers demand higher subsidies and quicker compensation for crop and livestock losses due to the 2023 floods, alongside grievances over diesel tax, rising electricity bills and reduced state and EU subsidies. Those are the ranges of reasons for which farmers are protesting all over the Europe. Thing like this never happened in the history of European Union, and in a broader sense, it never happened in the history of Europe. The thing is that the reasons behind those protests are self-inflicted policies, the policies that the European Union creates, not being pushed by anyone to do it. So what's the reason for which we, as European Union states, commit this kind of strange suicide, to paraphrase the title of the great book by Douglas Murray? You can join us on rackracon.com, that's our Substack. You can leave us your email as we send you and report every important information and every important analysis from the front lines of the war against the West. And that's what we are going to talk about on my show. My name is Michał Rachonio. This is Rackracon. And we roll in. And tonight, to talk about the farmers' protest, Ralph Schöllhammer, our guest and friend of our show, political scientist, lecturer, man who you can find online, and not only online, everywhere, in every place where interesting things are being debated. Ralph, great to have you again on our program.
Michał, thank you so much. Very high praise. I tried to live up to the expectation.
Ralph, we talked about the green policies of Europe. I asked you several times a question about the reasons behind Europe committing economical suicide, which is basically a part of the whole idea of self-inflicted tax revolution, diminishing and destroying industries of Europe. But right now, as we speak, all around Europe, we see massive protests of farmers. And those protests vary in terms of the specific reasons in different countries, but there is one common denominator, which is the Green Deal. So what do you make of it as a scientist who is watching and who is dealing with the ecological, eco-issues, energy issues? Are you surprised with that?
Well, not really. Look at it from that perspective. Like, very often we see revolutionary movements that started out with something that was not directly connected to the revolution that followed. Right? Think about the United States. Right? The original problem between the United States, or what became the United States, and Great Britain was a tax issue. Think about the French Revolution, right? It originally started with the budgetary problem of the French state. And I think what we see now happening in Europe is similar. The farmers, like in Poland, have different issues with their government than the farmers in Germany, than the farmers in France, than now increasingly also the farmers in Britain. But what ties it all together, I think, is a sense, and this is why so many people are interested in it and are supporting it. They sense that this is an opportunity to express their dissatisfaction in a way they couldn't do it in recent years. So a lot of this is the Green New Deal is kind of one overarching theme, but I think it's more than that. It's the sense that the bureaucracy in Brussels, and very often also the bureaucracies in national governments, that they no longer serve the primary interests of the people, right? Whether it's energy policy, whether it's migration policy, whether it's agricultural policy. And I think this all gets now bundled together in the farmers' protests that serve as an expression, as a pressure valve, if you want, of the dissatisfaction of the people. So the elites, if you want, and I'm careful with this term, in Brussels, in London, in Berlin, like they have to be very careful, because this is no longer just a farming issue. That was the beginning. But now you can see like more and more and more other movements latch onto this. I mean, we talked about this shortly before the show, there is the impression, justifiably so, there are some people in Europe who have massive representation, even though they're not necessarily particularly popular with the people. For example, the ideology of the Green parties is massively overrepresented in Brussels, whereas the ideology, for example, let's say, of the industrial heart, of the working class, is massively underrepresented. And they kind of find themselves in these farmer movements. Whether the farmers themselves are happy about this remains to be seen, but I think this is where the journey is going.
Ralph, let me stop here for a second, because actually you touched upon the point, and I didn't think about it in this way. When you said it, it's quite obvious. I mean, if someone thought that the Green Deal, the net zero policy, whatever you call it, is a mainstream policy of each and every mainstream political party of Europe, you would think that the green parties, which are concentrated on these eco issues, should be actually ruling in every state of European Union. But it's very hard to find such states. Germany is certainly one of them. There are a couple of green parties, but those are not the biggest parties with the biggest support. This is not the issue. This is not the case of any of those states. There is a huge difference between the real voting power and voting decisions of the people, the voters, and the green ideology. One doesn't match the other. Why?
Yeah, well, look at it from this perspective. You are absolutely correct. So, and this is particularly true for Western Europe. So if you look at the overall election results, right, the Green parties are somewhere usually between 9 and 15%. But now let's look at how represented is the Green Party, for example, among journalists. There it's all of a sudden 50%. How represented are they among, academics in the university settings? There it's, 60, 70%. How represented are they in the cultural class, like, entertainment, popular culture? There it's also significantly over 50%. The Green Party and their ideology, like, they don't have the masses behind them, but they have all the cultural, societal institutions behind them, because they were, as the famous saying goes, they were marching through the institutions. The big problem that the working class and, let's say, the center-right parties had and still have, they believe, every 4 or 5 years there's an election, we stand for election, hopefully we win. Whereas the left always said, elections are just one part of the picture, right? That's one battle in a larger war. So they made sure that they control the media, that they control the cultural institutions, that they control the universities. And they were successful. And now we see, as you correctly described it, we see their oversized, their entirely outsized influence when it comes to policy and decision making. I mean, it's absurd. Look at Ursula von der Leyen. Ursula von der Leyen, on paper, is a member of the German Conservative Party. But look at her priorities. Look at the way in which she was running the EU Commission. She was in name a conservative, but in action, she was definitely more closer to the Greens than she was to anything else. For example, just for your viewers, she was speaking at a degrowth conference in the summer of last year, which is, of course, completely absurd for a supposedly free market conservative party. And we see this in other areas as well. The European conservatives are now backtracking a little bit, right? They're more critical now of the Green New Deal, but I think that's particularly because we have elections in June. I'm not sure if they will remember their criticisms the week after the elections actually took place.
Actually, what are your predictions regarding the election? Because among conservatives in Europe, there is a hope that I like this kind of hope, because since I am a conservative, I would like European Union to come back to its roots of the political organization of sovereign countries that realize part of their common interests together, which is not the case of European Union right now. But there is a kind of a hope. When I talk to politicians, when I ask a question to the members of European Parliament, conservative members of this institution, they claim that there is a possibility of switch of power in European institutions. And I truly do not believe that, because I've heard this kind of things before this Euro-parliamentary term. What's your take? Is that possible, that the mainstream parties, based on the protests like the one that we are talking about, could lose the majority in the European Parliament, and conservative parties, even though they are separate and then there are differences, huge differences between them, could become just so important that the creating of the European Commission, for example, wouldn't be possible without them?
Well, I think it's certainly possible, but you, I think, touched on the most important topic. There's a difference between someone being in office and someone being in power. So it's absolutely possible that you have this rightward shift in June and that certain offices will change who is actually holding these offices. But you must understand, and of course you know this, but also for your viewers, the EU is primarily a bureaucratic apparatus. So a lot of what's going on there is not decided in the European Parliament. A lot of this is decided within the European bureaucracy. And that bureaucracy is, of course, hard left-leaning. So what would be needed, I'm using this expression very carefully, so don't get me wrong, but basically you would have to purge the European bureaucracy and replace many of those bureaucrats with more conservative members and more conservative individuals. And I think that is going to be a very, very difficult process, because what we see now in the, the kind of new Green New Deal-ish direction of the EU, this has been built up over decades, and kind of to reverse this is going to be, I'm not saying it's impossible, but this is going to be a very, very long and a very, very tough fight. Well, I have very strong hopes on the Eastern Europeans. I think there is a schism, a division in Europe between Western Europe and, let's say, Central Eastern Europe. And I think the future of Europe lies within Central and Eastern Europe. By the way, in addition to the European Union, I was hoping that somebody from Poland would throw their hat in the ring as the new Secretary General of NATO. I think that would be a very strong sign. And by the way, I think it would also be deserved. I think the Eastern Europeans have to make much clearer that they want to play a more significant and stronger role within European, but also within global institutions. And let's be completely honest, I think they deserve it, right? Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic have done a fantastic job. The Visegrad Group has done a fantastic job, despite certain differences. I know not everything is perfectly well between Hungary and Poland at the moment, but I think that's just a rough patch that's going to change over time. But I think
that's actually very interesting. But from my perspective, because there were several campaigns, attempts to fill this position or similar position by different politicians from this part of the world. And the thing is that those geopolitical issues that are part of the debate between Europe, United States, Russia, China, in a way, are so tightly related to the huge money, huge business, huge geopolitical interests, that the position of NATO Secretary General or the European Union Foreign Commissioner, or the future position which is being discussed right now of the future Commissioner of EU on defense, those are not the things and the places where the real decisions are being made. So it's more symbolic, however very interesting. But I wanted to touch upon the issue that you actually raised here, because what you said, the lower ranks of high offices of European Commission, European institutions, are also part of the political equilibrium deal between members of the European Union member states. But if those officials, lower level, not the highest ones, really hold this kind of power, that means that we have developed a kind of a European deep state inside European Commission, inside those institutions?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, to be clear, I wouldn't even call it, even though I like the expression, but I wouldn't call it a deep state. You must think of it from this perspective. Every organization, your organization, the organization I work for, right, has a certain organizational culture. There are certain views within a company, within a club, within an association that dominate. And the same is true within the European Union as well. And that organizational culture tends to lean towards the left. So there is a natural inclination for those who are members of that bureaucracy to kind of block everything that they perceive as coming from the right and support everything that they perceive as coming from the left. But I don't think it can on occasion. We see this in the United States. It can take on almost conspiratorial qualities. But very often I don't think this is not necessarily what drives it. It's just people who believe that the right is tremendously dangerous and the left got it all right, and in order to prevent whatever catastrophe they believe might happen, right, they have to block whatever could come from everything that's even so slightly right of center. And this is, of course, in a sense, also why the European Union was created. I mean, I always say this ironically, but I mean it in parts, right? The European Union was created as a kind of a straitjacket for the darker impulses of the European people. The idea was, once you have the European Union and once you have that bureaucracy, that supranational bureaucracy in Brussels, right, fascism, nationalism, whatever you name it, right, can never kind of rise again, because we have then this bureaucratic force that simply will damp it out whenever it should become a possibility. But I think now we have reached a point where the cure is becoming the disease. And what I mean by this is, if you look in certain areas, how the European Union, how Brussels behaves, it is very authoritarian. It is quasi-imperialistic. And what I mean by this is, if the EU steps up and says, if certain countries like Hungary, like Poland, do not act as we want them to act, for example, we withhold funds, that's how the imperial center acts towards the periphery. This is not how a partnership or a union between equals would act. And I find that very worrisome.
Ralph, actually that in a way means, because you mentioned the Gramsci's march through the institutions, that this march was much more successful than probably even Gramsci expected.
Oh yeah, I mean this is something I believe where the left has been smarter than the right, because for the left, by the way, we see this in all areas even nowadays. On the right, we talk about environmentalism as one issue. We talk about transgenderism as one issue. We talk about foreign policy as one issue. For the left, all of this is a broader issue, is one large war that they are fighting. And this is, I think, why the right loses so often. We fight individual battles and they fight a broader war. And I think that gives them, we saw it in relation to Israel, for example, right? This is all part and parcel of their larger worldview. And I think this is, whether we are like the outcome of this, that's a separate topic. But as a strategy, I think this was very successful. And to be quite honest, as you correctly pointed out, the left was always honest about this. I find it these days very absurd that look at the migration question. Right? It's everybody is now like, oh, how could that happen? How was that possible? Like, they've been telling us this for decades.
That's true. They actually, it was and it is still a part of every political agenda, every political platform, or of every not only left-leaning parties, because the paradox of this situation is that parties that consider themselves conservative parties, even right-wing parties, also adopt this agenda, the green agenda, the migration agenda, all others, many other the agendas that was previously, originally a part of the new left. My final question is the question coming back to the issue of the farmers' protest. It doesn't look, it's not obvious for me that those farmers that are protesting, because we are actually talking here about the conservative movement, about right-wing, left-wing, but for me it's obvious that those are not people who consider being right-wing or left-wing, but somehow this massive protest is framed or viewed through that lens. What's the reason behind it? What's your take on this?
Well, I think this is just the usual media reaction. And I think this is, if we just take Germany as an example, there's this weird confusion that when people demonstrate or protest against the government, that they are protesting against democracy or against the state, because that's another problem I think that the left has. They believe that they're entitled to rule, that they're entitled to govern. And everybody who demonstrates against them is not just demonstrating against policies or governance, they are demonstrating against the state and are thereby enemies of the state, if you want. So there is a lot, I think we sometimes, because, and this is particularly true for the media, they have such a soft spot for the left that they very often overlook the kind of authoritarian language that comes out of the left. I find this always kind of a little bit befuddling. But the broader issue is, at this point, I think it really doesn't matter anymore whether these protests are right-wing or left-wing, because if you would ask the farmers in the Netherlands, the farmers in Poland, I think the answer they would give you is, we protest about very specific issues that are neither right nor left. But they have become the tip of the spear, if you want, for a right-wing movement. And the reason for this, I believe, is because food, farming, agriculture is something that people can relate to. So this is a very effective thing, and the right wants to use it. And to be quite honest, I wish them the best of success with it. But as we said at the beginning of today's show, it might have started with the farming issue, but I think it is growing into something bigger, because there is a widespread dissatisfaction, especially with EU institutions, but also with local institutions. And you said this quite correctly early on, right? There is a significant number of people who feel they don't have a voice, and now they feel that the farmers can be a megaphone, right, to say things that the farmers themselves might not even want to talk about, but they can serve as a megaphone for broader issues. And I think that is necessary. The democratic process lives from the inclusion of everything that worries the people, and not just the issues of a small segment of, center-left or far-left politicians.
Ralph, because this is actually a follow-up question. how come, what happened that we've traveled from the European Union of steel and coal, which was the fundamentals of European Union, to a place, to a situation in which we are discussing whether we should even produce food in Europe, because basically that's the bottom line. I mean, it's madness.
Well, I think, everybody always talks negatively about Francis Fukuyama's end of history, but the Europeans behave as if the end of history has happened. Look at some of the major issues, exactly what you mentioned, that we are dealing with. We can no longer solve the big problems, so we have all these luxury problems. Like, as you say, how much meat should you eat? Should you drink milk? Is cheese really good for you? How many genders are there? I mean, these are all problems that we can talk about in times of peace and prosperity, but if we look what's currently happening in the world, somebody should stand up, and I hope this is going to be a consequence of this, and say, okay, this was a lot of fun in the 1990s where we had the time and patience for that, but now we actually have to focus on real issues. And again, Poland is not affected by this because your economy is doing really well, but the Polish economy alone cannot shoulder Europe. So what's going on in Germany, the deindustrialization, because of these ideological reasons, is going to be a problem for Europe, right? And we all know, I don't have to tell you this, and I don't have to tell your Polish viewers and listeners this, if Germany is descending into chaos, usually what comes out of it is not good for anybody. And I think that problem or that risk is still there.
That's absolutely true. And the thing that worries me and worries lots of people around the world is the question of the reasons for which this kind of economical suicide is being committed by Europe, by the continent, that the Western culture, the Western civilization that we are all part of was built. And those are the important questions that we are going to try to ask again next time when we see Ralph on our program. Ralph, thank you very much for your time, for your presence on Telewizja Republika.
Thank you so much for having me.
See you soon. Ladies and gentlemen, you can join us on Substack, that's our address. You can leave us your email as we try to deliver you daily reports from the front lines of war waged against the West. Take care. See you next week.